My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I serve as the president of Burkina Faso, a country in West Africa that many people in the world rarely think about unless tragedy appears on the news. Yet behind the headlines there are real people, farmers who wake before sunrise to work the land, mothers who pray for their children every night, young soldiers who stand guard so their villages can sleep in peace. I speak to you today not only as a president, I speak as a man who has seen fear, hope, loss, and faith in the eyes of ordinary people. Many of you who are listening to this story are older than me. Some of you have lived through wars, political changes, and difficult times in your own country. Because of that, you understand something that younger generations sometimes forget. Leadership is not only about power. Leadership is about conscience. In February of the year 2026, I traveled to Germany to attend one of the most important international meetings in the world. It is called the Munich Security Conference. Every year, this conference gathers leaders from many nations. Presidents, ministers, generals, diplomats, and experts all meet to discuss the future of global security. That year, the conference took place from the 13th to the 15th of February. The location was the famous Hotel Bayerischer Hof in the city of Munich. More than 500 political leaders and security experts were present. Nearly 90 countries sent representatives. Over 700 international journalists filled the halls with cameras and microphones. There were more than 150 strategic discussions scheduled during those days. The subjects included global conflicts, terrorism, economic cooperation, and the changing balance of power in the world. For Africa, one of the most important topics was the Sahel region. The Sahel is a vast area stretching across several African nations. It has suffered greatly from terrorism, instability, and foreign interference. My country, Burkina Faso, stands directly in the middle of that struggle. That is why I was invited to speak. I arrived in Munich with several African leaders. We came prepared to talk about security, economic independence, and the future of our continent. But something unusual began to happen almost immediately. During the first hours of the conference, many conversations felt strange to me. Some leaders asked polite questions about Sahel security. Some journalists asked about political alliances. Yet again and again, another question appeared. Not about strategy, not about economics. They kept asking me something else. Why do you always mention Jesus Christ when you speak in international meetings? At first, I thought the question was simply curiosity. Perhaps they wanted to understand the faith that guides many African people. So I answered honestly. I told them that many leaders today have allowed power and ambition to silence their conscience. In political meetings, they speak only about interests, deals, and calculations. But when the name of Jesus is spoken, something deeper begins to stir inside a person. Conscience wakes up. A few people listened quietly. Some nodded with respect, but others did not hide their discomfort. And in the next 3 days, I began to realize something troubling. Some people did not merely disagree with what I believed. They wanted me to stop speaking about it completely, not as friendly advice, not as a suggestion. They wanted silence. Those 3 days at the Munich Security Conference changed something in me, because what happened there revealed a truth that every leader must one day face. There are moments when power asks you to compromise your conscience. And in those moments, a person must decide who they truly serve. This story is about those 3 days, and about why I refused to remain silent. When I arrived in Munich on the 13th of February, in the year 2026, the winter air was cold and still. Snow had fallen earlier that week, and the streets of the city carried that quiet European winter atmosphere that many travelers describe as calm and orderly. The Hotel Bayerischer Hof stood in the center of the city like a place where many decisions about the world had quietly passed through its halls. For decades, that hotel had hosted one of the most important security conferences on earth. Presidents, ministers, generals, intelligence chiefs, and international journalists had walked those same corridors year after year. That morning, I entered the building surrounded by cameras, interpreters, and security personnel. Yet despite the busy atmosphere, I felt something unusual. It was not fear. It was not excitement. It was a quiet awareness that something important would happen during those days. At the time, I could not explain why. The first hours passed with normal diplomatic conversations. Leaders greeted one another, advisors exchanged documents. Journalists waited near conference doors hoping to capture short statements. Most of the early discussions focused on the Sahel region of Africa. Many Western governments had strong opinions about what should happen there. They spoke about terrorism. They spoke about stability. They spoke about cooperation between nations. But very few of them spoke about the deeper reality that the people of the Sahel live with every day. When terrorism destroys a village, it is not a statistic. It is a mother burying her child. It is a farmer watching his land burn. It is a young soldier writing a final message to his family before entering battle. That reality was in my mind as I walked through the corridors of that hotel. Around the middle of the afternoon, at approximately 3:30, I entered a closed meeting dedicated to the Sahel security situation. The meeting took place inside one of the large conference rooms known as the Munich Security Conference. Inside the room were around 40 high-level leaders and advisors. Some were defense ministers, some were diplomats, some represented international organizations. Among them were well-known figures in global politics. The German Minister of Defense Boris Pistorius was present. The United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken sat among the delegates. The European Union's foreign policy representative Josep Borrell also participated. There were advisors connected to NATO and security experts from several nations. The discussion lasted nearly 2 hours. During that time, many complex ideas were presented. Some speakers described military cooperation in the Sahel. Others discussed intelligence sharing between governments. Several participants spoke about humanitarian aid and economic development. I listened carefully to every argument. When my turn came to speak, I explained that the security of Africa cannot be built only through outside strategies. The people of Africa must have the freedom to determine their own future. Our nations cannot remain permanently dependent on decisions made far away in foreign capitals. Some participants nodded in agreement. Others listened politely without expressing emotion. That is normal in international meetings. Diplomacy often hides true opinions behind calm expressions. Eventually, the meeting came to an end. Leaders gathered their documents and slowly began leaving the room. Some walked toward the next conference session. Others stopped to speak with journalists waiting outside. As I stepped into the hallway outside the Königssaal, a man approached me. He introduced himself as a communications advisor connected to the conference organization. His tone was polite. His posture was respectful. But the words he spoke carried something different. He said, "Mr. President Traoré, there is a small recommendation we would like to share with you regarding your upcoming public remarks." I looked at him calmly and asked what he meant. He paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he said, "During official speeches at the conference, we advise that you avoid mentioning religion or references to Jesus Christ." For a brief moment, the hallway around us felt strangely quiet. Many people were passing by. Journalists were speaking in several languages. Yet in that moment, it felt as if the world had paused. I looked directly at him and asked a simple question. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" He replied carefully, "It would be better if your speeches focused only on political and security matters." I asked him another question. "Are you saying that I should not speak about my faith?" Again, he hesitated. Then he answered, "We simply believe that such references may make certain leaders uncomfortable." His tone remained polite, but I had already understood the message behind his words. This was not only a suggestion, it was a warning. He was telling me that some people present at that conference did not want to hear the name of Jesus spoken in that room. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I asked him something very direct. "Is my faith now considered inappropriate for an international discussion?" He responded quickly, "No, Mr. President, that is not what we are saying." But his explanation did not truly answer the question. Instead, he repeated the same phrase again. "We simply want to avoid unnecessary controversy." Those words remained in my mind long after the conversation ended. Avoid controversy. In other words, remain silent about something important. I thanked him politely and continued walking through the hallway. Yet as I moved toward the next meeting, I could feel that something had changed. This conference was supposed to be about security, about cooperation between nations, about solving global problems. And yet, before I had even delivered a major speech, someone had already tried to shape what I was allowed to say. Not about politics, not about military strategy, but about faith. Later that afternoon, I spoke with several African colleagues who were also attending the conference. We discussed the security situation in the Sahel, but I also shared with them the unusual conversation that had just taken place. Some of them were not surprised. One leader quietly said something that stayed with me. He said, "In many international rooms, faith is welcome only when it remains invisible." Those words captured a reality that many people understand but rarely say out loud. In villages across Africa, people pray openly. In churches across America, people speak about God without hesitation. But in certain international political spaces, faith is often treated as something that should remain hidden. As evening approached, I walked again through the corridors of the Bayerischer Hof. Journalists were preparing for the next day's panel discussions. Security officers moved quietly through the building. Diplomats gathered in small groups for private conversations. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Yet inside my mind, the question continued to echo. Why were some people so concerned about the possibility that I might mention Jesus in a speech? What exactly were they afraid of? At that moment, I did not yet know the answer. But before the night ended, the pressure would grow stronger, and the message would become even clearer. Some people at that conference truly wanted me to remain silent, not about politics, not about strategy, but about faith itself. And that realization was only the beginning. After my brief conversation with the communications advisor outside the conference room, I continued walking through the corridors of the Hotel Bayerischer Hof. The building was full of movement. Journalists hurried between sessions carrying cameras and recorders. Diplomats spoke quietly in small circles. Security personnel watched the entrances and elevators with calm discipline. At a large international conference, this constant motion is normal. Every minute, another discussion begins somewhere in the building. Yet inside my mind, the earlier conversation continued to echo. Why would mentioning faith cause such concern? Why would speaking about Jesus in a personal context be treated as something dangerous? These questions followed me as the afternoon slowly moved toward evening. Around early evening, a little after 20 minutes past 6, I left one of the discussion areas on the second floor of the hotel. The hallway was long and lined with soft lights reflecting against polished walls. Delegates from many countries were moving through the corridor on their way to evening meetings or interviews with journalists. As I walked toward the elevators, two men approached me. Both introduced themselves as diplomats connected to European security institutions. One of them worked within the European Union's external diplomatic service. The other was described as a senior security advisor. Their tone was polite, just as the communications advisor had been earlier. But there was something deliberate in the way they had chosen this moment to speak with me privately. One of them said, "President Traoré, we would like to briefly discuss the attention your participation is receiving from international media." I nodded and waited for him to continue. He explained that many major news organizations were closely following my presence at the conference. He mentioned several names. France 24, Der Spiegel. He said that journalists from those organizations had already requested interviews and were paying particular attention to my statements about African sovereignty and regional security. None of that surprised me. International conferences often attract strong media interest. But then he added something else. "If certain topics appear in your speech tomorrow," he said carefully, "it may create a diplomatic controversy." I looked at him and asked a simple question. "What topics are you referring to?" He answered directly, "References to Jesus Christ or religious themes." The conversation had now become unmistakably clear. This was the second time in the same day that someone had approached me with the same concern. I asked him calmly, "Are you suggesting that speaking about my faith would cause a diplomatic crisis?" He shook his head slightly. "No, not a crisis," he said, "but it could provoke unnecessary tension." The second diplomat then added something that revealed even more. "Some leaders believe that international security discussions should remain strictly secular." I listened carefully to those words. Strictly secular. That phrase carries different meanings for different people. For some, it simply means that governments should not impose religion on citizens. But in that hallway conversation, the meaning seemed different. It sounded more like this. Faith should remain invisible. Faith should remain silent. Faith should remain private. I asked them another question. "So if I speak about my faith as part of my personal motivation for leadership, that is considered inappropriate?" They looked at each other briefly before answering. One of them said, "It may be misunderstood by some participants." I asked again, "Misunderstood in what way?" The answer came slowly. "In a political environment like this, religious language can be interpreted as moral judgment." Those words revealed the deeper concern. Some people fear that the mention of Jesus might imply something about conscience, about right and wrong, about truth and accountability. And those are topics that often make powerful people uncomfortable. For a moment we stood there in silence while delegates continued walking past us. Finally I spoke again. "Let me ask you something honestly," I said. "Is the real issue that I am talking about faith? Or is the real issue that some people do not want to hear the name of Jesus in a political space?" Neither of the diplomats answered immediately. Instead, one of them repeated the same careful phrase used earlier by the communications advisor. "We simply want to avoid unnecessary controversy." The sentence sounded very polite. But behind those words there was a clear request. Do not say certain things. Do not bring certain ideas into the room. Do not disturb the atmosphere. Yet leadership is not about protecting comfort. Leadership is about speaking truth when it matters. I thanked them for their perspective and continued walking down the hallway. The elevators opened and closed as delegates moved between floors. A group of journalists rushed past carrying microphones and camera equipment. The conference continued exactly as planned, but something inside me had begun to change. The pattern was now obvious. First a communications advisor, then two diplomats, all repeating the same concern, all asking for the same silence. Later that evening, during a small reception gathering, I observed many conversations among leaders and experts. Discussions about military cooperation, debates about economic sanctions, arguments about global alliances. In those rooms, people spoke freely about power, money, weapons, and strategy. No one suggested that those topics were inappropriate. No one suggested that discussing war or political influence might cause controversy. Yet the simple mention of faith had suddenly become a sensitive issue. That contrast stayed with me. In a world where governments openly discuss weapons and conflict, why should the name of Jesus be treated as dangerous? As the evening continued, I stepped outside the hotel for a few minutes. The air in Munich was cold, only a few degrees above freezing. The city lights reflected softly on the wet pavement. Cars moved quietly along the street while security vehicles stood near the entrance. I looked at the winter sky and thought about the people back home in Burkina Faso. Many of them live in villages far from international conferences and political debates. But every evening, in small churches or simple homes, they pray. They pray for safety. They pray for peace. They pray for their leaders. And many of them pray for me by name. At that moment, a thought entered my mind. If those people could speak openly about their faith in small villages across Africa, why should a president be asked to hide his faith in a room full of world leaders? The contrast felt deeply unfair. Inside the hotel, powerful people discussed the future of nations. But outside those rooms, ordinary people continued living lives shaped by faith, hope, and prayer. And I began to realize something important. The real conflict at that conference was not about diplomacy. It was about conscience. Some people believe faith should remain silent in public leadership. But for me, faith was the very reason I accepted the responsibility of leadership. Without conscience, power becomes dangerous. Without moral guidance, politics becomes empty. And without faith, many leaders slowly lose the courage to speak truth. As the evening ended, I returned to my room inside the hotel. The next day would bring the most important public discussion of the conference. A large panel about the future of the Sahel. Hundreds of delegates would attend. Dozens of international news organizations would broadcast the session. And I already knew that some people would be listening very carefully, not only to what I said, but to whether I obeyed the quiet pressure that had already begun. That night I understood something clearly. The real test had not yet arrived, but it was coming. And the next day would reveal whether I would remain silent or speak openly. The morning of the 14th of February in the year 2026 arrived quietly in Munich. Winter light filtered through the tall windows of the Hotel Bayerischer Hof, casting a pale glow across the conference halls. Outside, the temperature hovered just above freezing. The city moved slowly under gray skies as if the cold itself had settled over the streets. Inside the hotel, however, the atmosphere was anything but slow. The second day of the Munich Security Conference is often the busiest. Delegates move quickly from one panel to another. Journalists fill the corridors waiting for statements. Cameras are placed in strategic positions long before the speakers arrive. That morning I woke early. Not because of the noise in the hotel, but because my mind was already working through the conversations of the previous day. Two separate approaches had already been made. Two different groups of people had advised me to avoid speaking about Jesus. Neither conversation had been aggressive. No one had threatened me. No one had raised their voice. But pressure does not always arrive in the form of anger. Sometimes pressure arrives as polite advice. Sometimes it arrives disguised as concern. And sometimes it arrives wrapped in the language of diplomacy. Yet beneath all those words, the message remains the same. Do not say this. Remain quiet about that. Focus only on what we consider acceptable. As I prepared for the day, I thought about the panel discussion scheduled for mid-morning. The subject was the future of the Sahel region. This discussion was important not only for Africa, but for many international partners. The Sahel has become one of the most unstable regions in the world. Terrorist groups operate across borders. Governments struggle to maintain security. Millions of people live with uncertainty. That was the reality I intended to speak about. But by that morning, another question had also entered the situation. Would I follow the quiet instructions that had been given the day before? Or would I speak exactly as my conscience guided me? I did not yet know the final answer, but I knew something else. Whatever choice I made would be seen by many people around the world. Shortly before 10 o'clock that morning, I walked toward the large conference hall where the Sahel panel would take place. The hallway outside the room was crowded with journalists. Camera operators adjusted their equipment. Assistants checked seating lists and technical schedules. Inside the hall, more than 300 delegates were already taking their seats. Rows of chairs filled the room. Bright stage lights illuminated the front platform where the speakers would sit. Large television cameras pointed toward the stage from several angles. More than 40 international media organizations were present to cover the discussion. This was not a private conversation. Everything spoken on that stage would reach the world within minutes. As I approached the entrance to the hall, several conference staff members were coordinating the final preparations. One of them recognized me and stepped forward. He was part of the communications team responsible for managing the speakers. His voice was respectful but direct. "Mr. President," he said, "may we speak with you for a moment before the session begins?" I agreed. We moved a few steps away from the main entrance so that journalists would not overhear the conversation. He glanced briefly at the notes in his hand, then looked up again. "There is just one small reminder regarding the content of your remarks," he said. I already knew what was coming, but I allowed him to continue. "We asked that speakers avoid references to personal religious beliefs during the panel discussion." There it was again. The third request. The same message repeated once more. For a moment I simply looked at him. Then I asked calmly, "Is this instruction directed only at me?" He hesitated slightly before answering. "It applies to all speakers," he said. But the tone of his voice suggested that the request was meant particularly for me. I asked him another question. "Who decided that faith should not be mentioned in this discussion?" He shifted his weight slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "The conference organizers believe it keeps the discussion focused on policy and security," he replied. I nodded slowly. Then I asked something very simple. Did the organizers also tell the other speakers not to mention ideology, political values, or national interests? He did not answer immediately, because everyone in that building knew the truth. International conferences are filled with ideological language. Speakers talk about democracy. They talk about freedom. They talk about human rights. They talk about political systems and economic philosophies. Those are all belief systems. Yet only one type of belief had suddenly been declared inappropriate. Faith. I looked at the man standing in front of me. He seemed like a decent professional simply doing his job. So I spoke to him calmly, not with anger. "Faith is not a political weapon for me," I said. "It is the reason I serve my people." He listened quietly. Then he responded in a careful tone. "We understand that, Mr. President, but the environment here is very sensitive." Sensitive. Another word that often appears when people want to avoid uncomfortable truths. I asked him one final question. If faith gives a leader the courage to serve his nation honestly, why should that be hidden? The staff member did not respond. He simply nodded politely, as if the conversation had reached a point where no further explanation could change anything. A few seconds later, another staff member approached and said that the panel would begin soon. The speakers were asked to move toward the stage. As we walked inside the conference hall, I noticed the scale of the audience. Rows of delegates filled the room. Representatives from many countries sat together in quiet expectation. Journalists prepared their devices to capture every word. The atmosphere was serious but calm. I took my seat on the stage beside the other panelists. Among them were European officials, NATO analysts, and representatives connected to international organizations. Large screens displayed the title of the session behind us. The moderator introduced each speaker to the audience. Applause followed each name, but inside my mind another conversation continued. 3 times I had now been advised to remain silent about something important to me. 3 times I had been told that mentioning Jesus would be inappropriate. 3 times the request had been framed as simple diplomatic caution. And now I sat on a stage where hundreds of people were waiting to hear what I would say. Sometimes leadership arrives in quiet moments like this. Not in battle, not in crisis, but in the silence before speaking. The moderator began the discussion by asking questions about security cooperation in the Sahel. Each panelist spoke in turn. The conversation moved through familiar topics: military coordination, economic development, regional stability. I listened carefully to the earlier speakers. They spoke intelligently about strategies and policies. But as the discussion continued, I noticed something important. Many of the problems being described were not only technical, they were moral. corruption, broken promises, leaders who serve themselves instead of their people. Those issues cannot be solved by strategy alone. They require conscience, and conscience often grows from faith. As the moderator prepared to invite me to speak, I looked out at the audience. Hundreds of faces watched the stage. Dozens of cameras waited. Some people in that room were hoping I would follow the advice that had been given. Others were simply curious about what I might say. In that moment, I remembered something very simple. Back in Burkina Faso, there are villages where people gather every Sunday morning in small churches made of brick or wood. Many of those people have very little wealth, but they have faith. They pray for peace. They pray for justice. They pray for leaders who will speak truth. And suddenly I realized something important. If I allowed fear of controversy to silence my faith in that room, I would not only disappoint myself, I would disappoint the people who believe that leadership must remain connected to moral courage. The moderator finally turned toward me. Mr. President Traoré, he said, we would now like to hear your perspective on the future of the Sahel. The microphone in front of me was live. The room was silent, and the real decision had arrived. But the most important moment was still ahead, because later that day, after the panel discussion ended, the pressure would become even more direct, and the question would become unavoidable. Would I obey the unspoken rule that faith must remain hidden in global politics? Or would I speak openly about the source of my strength? That answer would come the following day, and it would surprise many people in that room. When the panel discussion about the Sahel ended that morning, the room filled with the sound of polite applause. It was not the loud applause of celebration. It was the careful applause that usually follows diplomatic discussions. The moderator thanked the speakers. Delegates began standing up. Journalists quickly moved toward the front rows, hoping to ask questions. Large conferences always move quickly after a session ends. Cameras are packed away. Translators remove their headsets. Advisors hurry toward the next meeting. I shook hands with the other panelists on the stage. Each of them had spoken with professionalism. Even when we disagreed about certain policies, the conversation had remained respectful. That is how international dialogue is supposed to work. But as I stepped down from the stage, I noticed several conference staff members waiting near the side entrance. One of them approached me and said quietly that a few organizers wanted to speak with me privately. This is not unusual after a public panel. Sometimes staff want to coordinate interviews or clarify scheduling. So I followed them toward a smaller hallway behind the stage area. The noise of the main conference hall faded as we moved into the quieter corridor used by speakers and technical staff. Inside that hallway were 3 people. 2 were conference advisors involved in managing the event. The third appeared to be connected to diplomatic coordination between delegations. Their expressions were serious but controlled. No one looked angry, but the atmosphere felt different from the earlier polite conversations. One of the advisors spoke first. Mr. President, he said, we appreciate your participation in the panel discussion this morning. I nodded and thanked him. Then he continued, however, we would like to revisit the guidance that was provided yesterday. There it was again, the guidance. The word had now become very familiar. Another advisor stepped forward slightly. We understand that faith is important to you, he said, but we strongly recommend that it not be included in your closing remarks tomorrow. His voice was calm. Yet this time, the request sounded firmer than before. Not a suggestion, not a casual reminder, a recommendation. I looked at the 3 men standing in front of me. Then I asked them a direct question. What exactly are you worried will happen if I mention Jesus? For a moment, none of them spoke. Finally, one of them answered, the concern is not about your personal belief. He paused briefly before finishing his sentence. The concern is about how certain audiences might interpret it. I asked him to explain. What interpretation are you referring to? The advisor took a breath before responding. Religious language can sometimes sound like moral criticism of other leaders. That sentence revealed something very important. They were not afraid of faith itself. They were afraid of what faith might expose. Because when faith enters a political conversation, questions of conscience often follow. And conscience is uncomfortable for people who prefer power without accountability. I asked them another question. So the real issue is that mentioning Jesus might make some leaders feel judged. The second advisor replied carefully, that is one possible outcome. Then he added something else. And the conference is intended to maintain a neutral environment. Neutral. It is an interesting word. Neutral can mean fair. Neutral can mean balanced. But sometimes neutral simply means avoiding difficult truths. I looked at them quietly for a moment. Then I asked something very simple. Are we allowed to talk about corruption in these discussions? They nodded. Of course. Are we allowed to talk about injustice? I asked. Yes, one of them replied. And are we allowed to talk about the suffering of people in the Sahel? I continued. Certainly, they said. I nodded slowly. Then why is the one thing that gives many people moral strength considered inappropriate? No one answered. The hallway remained silent for several seconds. Finally, one of the advisors spoke again. Mr. President, we are only trying to prevent unnecessary controversy. That phrase had now been repeated so many times that it almost sounded rehearsed. Prevent controversy. Avoid tension. Maintain neutrality. All of those phrases mean the same thing when used in this context. Please remain silent about this subject. But leadership is not built on silence. Leadership requires the courage to say what must be said, even when it creates discomfort, even when it challenges powerful people. I decided to speak honestly with them. My country is fighting terrorism, I said. Our soldiers risk their lives every day. Our citizens pray for peace every night. For many of them, faith is the only strength they have left. I looked at each of the advisors in turn. And you are asking me to pretend that this faith does not exist? The room remained quiet. One of the advisors shifted his posture slightly before speaking again. No one is asking you to deny your beliefs. He chose his words carefully. We are simply asking you not to emphasize them in a political speech. I understood the difference he was trying to create. Do not deny your faith. Just keep it invisible. Just do not mention it publicly. Just make sure it stays private. That is how faith is often treated in modern political spaces. Accepted quietly, but never spoken openly. I thanked the advisors for their concerns. Then I said something that seemed to surprise them. I will think carefully about what you have said. It was the honest truth. Because at that moment I had not yet decided exactly what I would say during the final session of the conference. The conversation ended politely. The advisors nodded and wished me a good afternoon. Then we all returned to the main corridors of the hotel. Outside the hallway, the conference continued with its usual rhythm. Journalists conducted interviews. Delegates moved between meetings. The world of diplomacy continued as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside my mind, the weight of those conversations remained. 3 separate moments of pressure had now occurred. First, the communications advisor outside the conference room, then the diplomats in the hallway, now the advisors behind the stage, all of them repeating the same request. Do not speak about Jesus. Do not bring faith into this conversation. Keep that part of yourself hidden. As the afternoon passed, I attended several additional discussions about African security and economic development. Many important ideas were exchanged. But even while listening to those debates, the same question continued to return. Why did the mention of Jesus create such discomfort among some leaders? In a world filled with political arguments, military strategies, and economic conflicts, why should the name of Christ be considered dangerous? That question stayed with me through the rest of the day. And that night, back in my hotel room, I would face it directly. Because before the conference ended, I would have to decide something very simple. Would I follow the advice that had been repeated so many times? Or would I speak from the same faith that millions of ordinary people carry quietly in their hearts? The answer would come the following morning. But the night before that decision would become one of the most important moments of reflection I experienced during the entire conference. That night, after the discussions of the second day ended, the Hotel Bayerischer Hof slowly grew quieter. The energy that had filled the conference halls during the day began to fade. Delegates returned to their rooms. Journalists finished filing their reports. Security officers remained at their posts, but the constant movement of people gradually slowed. It was late evening when I finally returned to my room. Outside the window, the city of Munich rested under the cold air of winter. The temperature had dropped to only a few degrees above freezing. The streetlights reflected softly on the pavement, and the occasional car moved quietly through the streets. Inside the room, the silence felt heavy. International conferences are often filled with speeches and meetings, but the most important moments sometimes happen when a person is alone. That night was one of those moments. I sat down near the window and allowed my thoughts to settle. During the past 2 days, 3 different groups of people had approached me with the same request. First, a communications advisor, then 2 diplomats, then conference organizers behind the stage, all of them polite, all of them careful with their words. But every conversation had carried the same message. Do not speak about Jesus. Avoid religious language. Keep faith outside the discussion. For a moment I closed my eyes and listened to the quiet of the room. Leadership can feel very public. People see speeches, meetings, and official appearances, but they rarely see the moments when a leader must confront his own conscience. That night was such a moment for me. I began thinking about my country. Burkina Faso is not a wealthy nation. We do not host the great conferences of the world. Our villages are simple. Our cities struggle with many challenges, but our people carry something powerful: faith. In many villages across Burkina Faso, when the sun sets and the evening becomes quiet, families gather together. Some gather in small churches made of brick. Some gather in open spaces under the sky. Some pray inside their homes. But in those moments, they speak openly to God. They pray for peace. They pray for protection. They pray for their children. And often, they pray for their leaders. Over the years, many people in my country have told me something that I have never forgotten. They say, "Mr. President, we pray for you every day." They do not pray for political success. They do not pray for international approval. They pray that I will have wisdom. They pray that I will have courage. They pray that I will remain honest. That kind of support carries a responsibility. Because when people pray for their leader, they are placing their trust not only in the person, but in the conscience of that person. That night I thought about those prayers. Then I asked myself a difficult question. If tomorrow I remain silent about my faith because powerful people feel uncomfortable hearing it, what does that say about my leadership? Would I be protecting diplomacy? Or would I be betraying something deeper? I stood up and walked slowly toward the window. The city lights of Munich spread across the distance. This was a place where many decisions about global security had been discussed for decades. Yet outside those conference rooms, ordinary life continued. People walked home from work. Families gathered for dinner. Children prepared for school the next day. And somewhere in that city, just like in my own country, people were praying. Faith is not something limited to Africa. It exists in every culture. It exists in every nation. Yet somehow in certain political spaces, faith becomes something that leaders are expected to hide. I began to realize something important that night. The real issue at the conference was not religion. The real issue was conscience. Because when faith enters a conversation about power, it raises uncomfortable questions. Questions about justice. Questions about responsibility. Questions about whether leaders truly serve their people or only serve their own interests. Those questions can make powerful people uneasy. And perhaps that is why some leaders prefer that faith remain silent. As I continued looking out at the quiet streets below, I thought about the soldiers of Burkina Faso. Many of them are young men. Some are barely older than 20. They stand on the front lines against terrorism. They protect villages that many people in the world have never even heard about. Before entering dangerous missions, many of those soldiers pray. Not because someone forces them, but because faith gives them strength. Faith reminds them that their sacrifice has meaning. Faith reminds them that courage is not only physical, but moral. If those young soldiers can carry their faith openly into battle, why should a president hide his faith in a conference hall? That question stayed with me for a long time. Eventually, I sat down again and reviewed the notes for the final session of the conference scheduled for the following day. It would be the closing discussion. More than 400 delegates were expected to attend. Approximately 150 journalists would be present. Several television networks planned to broadcast parts of the session live. The closing speeches often receive the most attention, and many people in that room would be listening carefully to see what I chose to say. The advisors had made their recommendation clear. Avoid references to Jesus. Focus only on policy. Remain within the safe boundaries of political language. But something inside me resisted that idea. Because leadership is not only about delivering carefully designed speeches. Leadership is about standing before others with honesty. If a leader begins to hide the true source of his strength, eventually everything else becomes performance. And that is a dangerous path. Before going to sleep that night, I said a quiet prayer, not a long prayer, just a simple one. I asked for clarity. I asked for courage. And I asked that whatever words I spoke the next day would serve truth rather than fear. Because the following morning would bring the final moment of decision. In front of hundreds of leaders and journalists, I would stand at the podium. Many people expected me to follow the quiet instructions that had been repeated for 2 days. Many believed that I would avoid controversy. But what happened during that final speech would surprise some of them. Because in that moment I realized something very simple. No conference, no organization, no political pressure has the authority to command a person to silence his faith. The next morning, when I walked toward the stage for the closing session of the Munich Security Conference, I already knew one thing clearly. Whatever happened afterward, I would speak honestly, and that decision would change the atmosphere in that room. The morning of the 15th of February arrived quietly, but inside the Hotel Bayerischer Hof, the atmosphere was already active long before midday. It was the final day of the Munich Security Conference. During those 3 days, hundreds of discussions had taken place. Leaders from many nations had spoken about global tensions, economic alliances, and the fragile balance of power shaping the modern world. For many participants, the closing session is the moment when ideas are summarized and final reflections are shared. That morning, the corridors of the hotel filled once again with journalists carrying cameras and microphones. Delegations moved quickly between rooms, holding last conversations before returning to their countries. I left my room later in the morning and walked through the lobby toward the main conference halls. Security officers stood quietly near every entrance. Assistants checked schedules and guided delegates to their seats. The entire building moved with the organized rhythm of a major international event reaching its final hours. Yet for me, the atmosphere felt different, because I knew that the moment of decision had arrived. For 2 days, I had heard the same message repeated by different voices. Avoid speaking about faith. Do not mention Jesus. Keep religion outside the discussion. Those requests had never been expressed with anger. But pressure does not always need raised voices. Sometimes pressure arrives wrapped in politeness. Sometimes it arrives disguised as professional advice. And sometimes it arrives as a gentle warning meant to guide your choices. As I walked through the hallway toward the final session, I could still hear the words that had been repeated the night before. Avoid controversy. Maintain neutrality. Focus on policy. Yet in my heart, another voice was also present. The voice of conscience. And conscience rarely speaks loudly. It speaks quietly but clearly. It reminds you who you are. It reminds you what you stand for. And it reminds you that leadership without moral courage eventually becomes empty. Around 15 minutes past 11 in the late morning, the closing session began. The large conference hall was already filled. More than 400 delegates sat in the audience. Representatives from governments, international organizations, military institutions, and academic centers had gathered for the final discussions. Along the back and sides of the room stood rows of journalists. Approximately 150 members of the press were present. Large television cameras pointed toward the stage, ready to capture every statement made by the speakers. The room carried a serious atmosphere, not tense, but attentive. Everyone understood that the final remarks of a conference often reveal deeper perspectives about the future. I waited briefly behind the stage while another speaker completed his remarks. Through a small opening near the curtain, I could see the audience. Some people were taking notes. Some watched the stage carefully. Others checked their translation devices as they prepared to listen to the next speech. I knew that among them were individuals who had already spoken to me during the previous days. Some of them were curious. Some were cautious. And perhaps a few were wondering whether I would follow the guidance they had offered. A staff member approached me and quietly informed me that my turn to speak would come soon. I nodded. Then I stepped slowly toward the entrance to the stage. Walking toward a podium is a simple action, but sometimes that short walk carries the weight of many decisions. Each step felt calm. There was no fear in my mind, only clarity. I thought again about the people in Burkina Faso, the farmers, the teachers, the soldiers, the mothers who pray every night for their children. Those people do not live in rooms filled with diplomats, but their lives are shaped by the decisions discussed in those rooms. And many of them believe deeply that leadership should remain connected to truth. I also thought about something else. Throughout history, many leaders have been remembered not for the power they held, but for the moments when they refused to silence their conscience. Those moments are rarely dramatic. Often they happen quietly. A person simply chooses honesty over comfort, truth over approval, faith over fear. When my name was announced, I walked onto the stage. The lights of the hall shone brightly across the platform. The audience sat quietly, waiting. For a moment I looked across the room. Hundreds of faces. Many cultures. Many beliefs. Many political interests. But beneath all those differences, every person in that room carried something in common. A conscience. Some people listen to that inner voice. Others try to ignore it. But it is always there. I stepped behind the podium and adjusted the microphone. The moderator introduced my role briefly and then invited me to begin my remarks. At that moment, the room became completely silent. The cameras were recording. Journalists prepared their notes. Delegates leaned slightly forward in their seats. I began speaking about the Sahel, about the reality that millions of Africans live with every day. Terrorism, economic challenges, the need for African nations to strengthen their own sovereignty. For several minutes, I spoke only about those topics. The audience listened carefully. Many of the ideas I presented had already been discussed during the conference. The importance of regional cooperation, the need for economic development, the responsibility of global partners to respect African independence. Everything I said during those first minutes remained within the boundaries of traditional diplomatic language. Exactly what many people in the room expected, and exactly what the advisors had recommended. But as my speech continued, I felt that familiar, quiet voice of conscience again. Because the conversation about security and politics was only part of the truth. Behind those discussions lived something deeper. The moral strength that allows people to endure hardship. The faith that gives ordinary citizens courage during difficult times. And the belief that leadership must answer not only to political systems, but also to something greater. After speaking for several minutes, I reached the final part of my prepared remarks. The safe ending. The diplomatic conclusion that would satisfy everyone in the room. I paused for a moment. The hall remained silent. Then I looked across the audience once more. In that moment, I remembered the conversations of the previous days, the polite requests, the quiet warnings, the repeated advice to remain silent about faith. And I realized that the final choice was now completely mine. No advisor could make it for me. No diplomat could guide it. No conference organizer could control it. Only conscience could decide. So before closing my speech, I did something unexpected. I stopped reading from my prepared notes. I looked directly at the audience, and I said something that several people in that room had hoped I would never say. The words that followed would change the atmosphere of that conference hall, and they would remind everyone present of something very simple. A person may hold political power, but no authority on earth has the right to command another human being to silence his faith. What I said next would be remembered long after the conference ended. The hall was silent when I stopped reading from my prepared notes. Until that moment, everything in my speech had followed the expected path of international diplomacy. I had spoken about security cooperation in the Sahel, about the need for African sovereignty, and about the responsibility of nations to support stability rather than dependency. Those were important topics. They were also safe topics. No one in the room would feel uncomfortable hearing them. But as I stood there at the podium, looking across the audience, I remembered the conversations that had taken place over the previous 2 days. The communications advisor who first approached me after the closed meeting, the diplomats in the hallway who warned about diplomatic controversy, the conference organizers who repeated their recommendation behind the stage. 3 times I had been advised to avoid mentioning faith. 3 times I had been asked to keep the name of Jesus outside the room. In that moment, standing before hundreds of delegates and journalists, I understood something very clearly. Silence can sometimes be more dangerous than speaking. Because when leaders begin to silence their conscience, it becomes easier to ignore the truth. So I paused. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then I said something that immediately changed the atmosphere in the hall. Before I leave this stage, I began slowly. There is something I would like to say that several people have advised me not to say. The words were simple. But the moment they left my mouth, the attention of the entire room sharpened. People stopped writing their notes. Journalists raised their eyes from their keyboards. Even the translators inside the glass booths leaned slightly forward as they prepared to interpret what I would say next. I continued speaking. My faith in Jesus Christ is the source of the strength that allows me to serve my country. The sentence was calm. There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, only honesty. But in that quiet moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. I could see some expressions change slightly. Some people appeared surprised. Others remained perfectly still, showing no visible reaction. But everyone in that room was listening carefully. I continued. And because of that faith, I said, there is something I cannot remain silent about. The cameras continued recording. Journalists began typing quickly again. Then I spoke the words that had been forming in my thoughts during those 3 days. Today, many leaders in the world speak constantly about peace, I said. They speak about cooperation, stability, and international responsibility. Yet, at the same time, many of the systems they support allow corruption to grow. Many of the agreements signed in comfortable conference rooms leave ordinary people poorer than before. I looked across the audience again. Some faces remained neutral. Some looked thoughtful. Then I continued. Some leaders speak about democracy while turning their backs on the suffering of ordinary citizens. Some speak about stability while supporting systems that quietly exploit weaker nations. The room remained silent. Then I said something that had been present in my thoughts since the first conversation about avoiding faith. And many of those leaders do not want to hear the name of Jesus Christ. There was a brief pause. Then I continued speaking before anyone could react. Not necessarily because they do not believe in him, I said, but because they know something very important. When the name of Jesus is spoken, conscience begins to speak as well. Those words were not meant as an attack. They were simply an observation. Throughout history, faith has often reminded people that power carries responsibility, that authority must answer to justice, that leadership must answer to truth, and conscience is something many powerful systems try to silence. I spoke slowly so that every translator in the room could carry the message clearly into the many languages being heard through headphones. Conscience is a difficult thing for people who prefer power without accountability, I continued. It reminds leaders that decisions made in comfortable rooms may affect people they will never meet. It reminds us that every policy, every alliance, and every agreement carries moral consequences. I could feel the atmosphere in the room becoming heavier, not hostile, but serious. Some people shifted slightly in their chairs. Others remained completely still. Then I said something that I knew would challenge the assumptions of certain listeners. Some leaders today try to remove faith from public life, I said. They say religion should remain private. They say faith should not be spoken in political spaces. But when poor families pray for protection in small villages, that prayer is not private. When mothers ask God to protect their sons from war, that prayer is not private. When soldiers pray before stepping into danger, that prayer is not private. That is the soul of a nation. Those words came from the reality of the people I represent. In many parts of Africa, faith is not separated from daily life. It shapes courage. It shapes endurance. It shapes hope. Then I spoke the sentence that brought everything together. No conference, I said slowly, no organization, and no political pressure has the authority to command a person to remain silent about his faith. The room was completely still. I finished the final lines of my speech calmly. I did not come here to please powerful people. I came here to speak truth as I understand it. And the truth is simple. The truth is simple. A world where leaders lose their conscience will eventually lose its peace. But a world where people still have the courage to speak about faith, truth, and justice still has hope. Then I spoke the final sentence. That is why I will never remain silent about Jesus Christ. For a moment, the room remained perfectly quiet. It lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds felt longer. In large conferences, audiences often react immediately to speeches. Applause begins quickly. People stand. Cameras flash. But this time, the first response was silence. Not rejection. Not approval. Just surprise. Several delegates looked toward one another. Journalists continued writing rapidly. The moderator sat still. Then, from somewhere toward the back of the hall, a few people began to clap. It was not a loud sound at first, just a handful of hands meeting. But slowly the applause spread through different parts of the audience. Not everyone joined. Some delegates remained seated without expression. Others offered polite applause. But the sound grew enough to fill the room. I stood quietly at the podium while the applause continued for several seconds. I did not raise my arms. I did not celebrate. Because the purpose of those words had never been to seek applause. They were simply the truth I felt compelled to speak. When the applause faded, the moderator thanked me for my remarks and moved the session toward its conclusion. The conference would continue with its final discussions. But something in that room had changed. Because everyone present now understood that the quiet pressure of the previous days had not succeeded. Faith had not been silenced. And the name that some people had hoped would remain unspoken had been spoken clearly. The reaction that followed would reveal something even more interesting, because the response inside that room was only the beginning. What happened afterward would show me something important about truth. Truth may sometimes create discomfort, but it also awakens courage in people who are quietly waiting for someone else to speak first. For the first few seconds after I finished speaking, the entire hall remained completely still. Silence can sometimes say more than applause. It was not the silence of rejection. It was the silence of surprise. Many people in that room had expected a normal diplomatic conclusion. They expected the speech to end with the familiar language of international cooperation and strategic partnership. Instead, they had heard something different. They had heard a leader speak openly about conscience and faith inside a political conference where those subjects are rarely mentioned. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but during those seconds I could see something happening across the audience. Some delegates leaned slightly toward the people sitting beside them. A few exchanged quiet glances. Others remained perfectly still, as if thinking carefully about what had just been said. Behind the audience rows, the journalists were already moving quickly. Many of them had lowered their heads and begun typing rapidly on laptops and phones. In conferences like this, reporters know when something unexpected has occurred, and they understand that those moments can become the headlines of the day. Then the first sound of applause appeared. It came from somewhere toward the back of the hall. At first it was just a few hands clapping slowly. Not loud, not dramatic, but clear. For a moment the rest of the room remained silent. Then a few more people joined the applause, and then more. The sound grew gradually. Not everyone stood up, not everyone applauded, but enough people did that the room filled with the sound of hands coming together. It was not a thunderous ovation. It was something quieter, but it carried meaning, because those claps represented individuals making their own decisions. Some of them may not have shared my faith. Some may not have agreed with every word I spoke, but they understood something important. They understood that a leader had chosen conscience over convenience. As I stood at the podium listening to the applause, I noticed different reactions across the audience. Some delegates nodded slightly as they clapped. Others maintained neutral expressions, offering polite applause without strong emotion. A few remained completely still. Their faces revealed little. That is normal in international gatherings. Political leaders are trained to control their expressions carefully. But even when faces remain calm, thoughts are still moving inside people's minds. I could also see several journalists near the front of the room speaking quietly into recording devices. Others were already sending messages through their phones. News travels quickly at international conferences. Within minutes, parts of the speech would already be moving through newsrooms around the world. After several seconds, the applause began to fade. The moderator stepped forward and thanked me again for the remarks. His voice remained professional, but I could sense that he understood the significance of what had just occurred. He then moved the session toward its closing comments, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. Even while the next speaker began talking, I could see that many people were still thinking about the words they had just heard. Some delegates looked down at their notes. Others leaned back quietly in their chairs. Several journalists continued writing long after the applause had ended. When the final session concluded, people slowly began standing and preparing to leave the hall. Conferences like this rarely end with dramatic scenes. Most people simply gather their belongings and move toward the next conversation. But that afternoon, many delegates approached me as we stepped down from the stage. Some offered handshakes. Others spoke only briefly. One European official quietly said something that stayed with me. He said, "Whether people agree or disagree, honesty always commands respect." Another participant from an African delegation smiled and said softly, "Many people were thinking what you said. You were simply the one who said it aloud." Not every reaction was positive. A few diplomats maintained a very formal tone when greeting me afterward. Their words remained polite, but their expressions suggested discomfort. That was expected. When truth enters a room, not everyone feels comfortable hearing it. But the purpose of those words had never been to satisfy everyone. The purpose was simply to speak honestly. As I walked through the corridor outside the conference hall, the atmosphere felt different from the earlier days. Journalists were already waiting near the exit. Cameras turned in my direction as soon as I appeared. Some reporters raised their microphones and asked questions immediately. "Mr. President, were you aware that some organizers advised you not to mention religion? Do you expect diplomatic consequences from your remarks? Do you believe faith should play a role in international politics?" The questions came quickly, but I answered calmly, because the decision had already been made. I told them something simple. A leader can face political pressure, I said, but conscience should never be silenced. Some reporters nodded while recording the answer. Others quickly wrote the sentence into their notes. Within a short time, the conference staff guided the journalists toward other speakers who were preparing their own statements. But I could already see that the story would travel beyond the walls of that hotel. In the hours that followed, people from different delegations continued discussing the moment that had taken place in the hall. Some debated the role of faith in politics. Others focused on the broader message about conscience and leadership. But beneath those discussions, something deeper had happened. The quiet pressure that had existed for 2 days had been broken. Faith had been spoken openly, and the room had not collapsed into chaos. Instead, it had simply listened. Later that afternoon, as the conference began its final closing activities, I found a quiet moment to reflect on what had just taken place. I did not feel anger toward the people who had advised me to remain silent. In many ways, they were simply protecting the traditions of diplomatic conversation. International politics often tries to avoid subjects that touch the deepest parts of human belief. But sometimes those subjects are exactly what leaders need to confront. Because without conscience, power becomes dangerous. And without moral courage, leadership becomes empty. That realization would become even clearer after the conference ended. Because in the days that followed, many journalists asked me the same question again and again. Were you afraid of the consequences? My answer was always the same. Fear is not the greatest danger for a leader. The greatest danger is losing the courage to speak truth. And the experience of those 3 days in Munich left me with a lesson I will never forget. Sometimes the simplest act of honesty can reveal more about the world than the most complicated political strategy. But the most important lesson would come afterward. Because when the conference ended and the cameras disappeared, I had time to reflect deeply on what those 3 days had truly meant. When the Munich Security Conference finally came to an end, the great halls of the Hotel Bayerischer Hof slowly returned to their usual quiet rhythm. The crowds that had filled the corridors during those 3 days began to disappear. Delegations prepared to return to their countries. Journalists packed their cameras and laptops. Security teams quietly guided leaders toward waiting vehicles outside the hotel. International conferences often end this way. For several days, the building becomes the center of global attention. Then suddenly the discussions are over, the microphones are turned off, and everyone moves on to the next responsibility. But for me, the experience of those 3 days did not end when the conference closed. Because the real conversation began afterward. As I left the conference hall that afternoon, several journalists approached me again. Their questions were direct. Some asked about politics. Some asked about diplomacy. But many of them asked about something deeper. They wanted to understand why I had chosen to speak about faith despite the advice I had received. One reporter asked me very clearly, "Mr. President, were you worried about diplomatic consequences?" It was a reasonable question. In international politics, every word spoken publicly can affect relationships between governments. Leaders often choose their language carefully in order to avoid creating tension. But my answer was simple. A leader can face political pressure, I told them calmly. But conscience and faith should never be silenced. Some of the journalists wrote those words down immediately. Others asked follow-up questions. They wanted to know whether I believed religion should play a formal role in political institutions. I explained that the issue was not about forcing belief on anyone. Faith cannot be imposed. Real faith is a personal conviction, but conscience is something every leader must carry. And for many people, faith is the source that strengthens that conscience. One journalist asked something that revealed a deeper curiosity. Do you believe that some leaders were offended by what you said? I paused for a moment before answering. Perhaps some were uncomfortable, I said. But discomfort is not always a bad thing. Sometimes discomfort simply means that an important question has been raised. And sometimes it means that a conversation has begun that people were trying to avoid. During the hours after the conference ended, I spoke with several participants from different countries. Some of them shared thoughtful reflections. One senior diplomat told me something that surprised me. He said, "Many people in this building have faith. They simply do not speak about it publicly." Another participant explained that in certain political environments, leaders are trained to keep their deepest beliefs private. Not because those beliefs are unimportant, but because the culture of international diplomacy often values neutrality above all else. I understood that perspective. Diplomacy requires balance. Leaders must work with people from many religions, many philosophies, and many cultures. Respecting those differences is important. But I also realized something else during those conversations. Neutrality should never mean abandoning conscience. A leader can respect the beliefs of others while still being honest about his own. Those two things are not enemies. They can exist together. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave Munich, I thought again about the events of those 3 days. The conference had gathered hundreds of powerful voices. Experts discussing global security. Officials debating political alliances. Analysts examining the future of international stability. All of those discussions were important. But sometimes the most important moment of a conference is not found in a complex strategy. Sometimes it appears in a simple decision. A decision to speak honestly. A decision to remain faithful to one's conscience. A decision to remember that leadership is not only about managing power. It is about guiding people with integrity. In the days that followed, several media outlets continued discussing the moment from the closing session. Some commentators focused on the role of faith in leadership. Others debated whether religious language should appear in political forums. But the deeper message was something simpler. People around the world recognized that a leader had chosen honesty instead of silence. And that kind of moment resonates far beyond the walls of a conference hall. I thought again about the people in Burkina Faso. The farmers working their land, the soldiers standing guard through long nights, the families who gather to pray together. Those people do not analyze diplomatic language. They do not attend global security conferences, but they understand something very important. They understand when a leader speaks from the heart, and they understand when a leader refuses to hide the values that guide his decisions. That realization became the true lesson of those 3 days in Munich. Leadership is not measured only by agreements signed or strategies discussed. It is measured by the courage to remain honest when pressure encourages silence. Every leader eventually faces that moment, a moment when the easy path suggests compromise, and the difficult path requires conviction. When that moment arrives, the choice is simple but powerful. Either you protect your comfort, or you protect your conscience. For me, the choice had already been made long before I stepped onto that stage. Because faith is not something that appears only during speeches. It is something that shapes decisions long before the microphone is turned on. And that is why the question journalists asked after the conference had such a simple answer. Was I afraid of the consequences? Because the greater consequence would have been silence. And silence, when truth needs to be spoken, is the one decision a leader should never accept. After the conference in Munich ended and the long journey back toward Africa began, I had time to think quietly about everything that had happened during those 3 days. International conferences move quickly while they are happening. Meetings follow one another without pause. Speeches are given. Questions are asked. Journalists rush to capture the next headline. But when the noise fades and the travel begins, that is when reflection truly starts. On the flight home, I looked out through the small window of the aircraft as the clouds passed slowly beneath us. The sky was calm. For the first time in several days, there were no microphones, no cameras, no conference rooms. Just silence. And in that silence, one thought became very clear. The real story of those 3 days was not about controversy. It was about conscience. Many people have asked me since then what lesson I took from the Munich Security Conference of the year 2026. Some expect a political answer. Some expect a strategic answer. But the truth is simpler than that. The most important lesson had nothing to do with politics. It had everything to do with leadership. A leader does not only stand before governments, a leader stands before his own conscience. And that responsibility is greater than any political pressure. Throughout history, the world has seen many leaders rise and fall. Some gain power through influence. Some gain power through military strength. Some gain power through wealth or alliances. But the leaders who are remembered with respect are usually the ones who remain faithful to their conscience, because power without conscience eventually destroys itself. A leader who becomes afraid to speak the truth will soon become afraid to defend his people. And once that fear takes control, leadership loses its purpose. During the conference in Munich, several people believed they were protecting diplomacy by advising silence. I do not blame them for that. They were acting according to the traditions of international politics. But leadership must sometimes move beyond tradition. It must sometimes ask difficult questions, and it must sometimes say things that people are not expecting to hear. Because truth has a way of cutting through the careful language of diplomacy. When I spoke about faith and conscience during that final session, I was not trying to create conflict. I was simply reminding the room of something that many people already knew but rarely say aloud. Political systems may guide policies. Economic systems may guide trade. Military systems may guide security. But conscience must guide leadership. Without conscience, every system eventually loses its direction. And for many people around the world, faith is the source that strengthens that conscience. It reminds leaders that power is temporary. It reminds leaders that every decision affects real human lives. And it reminds leaders that truth matters more than approval. As the aircraft continued its journey across the sky toward Africa, I thought again about the people who had been present in that conference hall. More than 400 delegates, more than 150 journalists, leaders from nearly 90 nations. Each of them carried their own beliefs, responsibilities, and hopes for the future. Some may have agreed with what I said, others may not have. But every person in that room understood that a moment of honesty had taken place. And honesty has a powerful way of leaving a lasting impression. Because when someone speaks from conscience, even those who disagree must acknowledge the courage behind it. By the time the aircraft began descending toward Africa, my thoughts returned to something even more important than conferences and speeches. They returned to hope. The world today faces many challenges. Conflicts between nations, economic uncertainty, terrorism and instability. Many people feel discouraged when they look at the headlines of international news. But I believe something very different. I believe that the world still has hope. Because as long as there are leaders willing to speak truth, as long as there are citizens willing to defend justice, and as long as there are people who keep faith alive in their hearts, the future can still change for the better. Hope does not come from perfect systems. Hope comes from people who refuse to abandon conscience. And that is the message I carried home from Munich. Leadership must remain connected to truth. Faith must never be forced into silence. And conscience must never be traded for convenience. If we remember those principles, then even in difficult times, the world can still move toward peace. I believe that sincerely. Not only for Africa, but for every nation, for the United States, for Europe, for Asia, for every place where people still desire justice and dignity. The world does not need perfect leaders, but it does need leaders who remember that power must answer to conscience. If that happens, then the sacrifices of ordinary people will never be ignored, and the prayers of families across the world will never be meaningless. Before I finish this story, I want to say something directly to those of you who have listened patiently. Perhaps you are listening from your home. Perhaps you are someone who has lived many years and seen the world change many times. You understand that truth is not always popular, but it is always necessary. So allow me to say these words clearly. I speak them not as a politician trying to persuade you, but as a man who believes that honesty still matters. I am Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, and what I have shared with you is the truth as I experienced it. I am Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, and these words come from my conscience. I am Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, and this story is the truth I have witnessed. If this story has spoken to you in some way, I invite you to continue listening to voices that encourage courage, faith, and hope in the world. And if you believe that conversations like this should continue, you are always welcome to return, share your thoughts, and be part of that discussion. Because the future of our world will not only be decided in conference halls, it will also be shaped by ordinary people who still believe that truth and conscience matter. And as long as those people exist, hope will never disappear.